Welcome to the Top 12 Highlights from Chapter 3. I'm Mr. Rodman, here to take you through it. Glad you can join me. Let's start by talking about federalism, the ultimate handshake between national and state government working together, sharing power in this constitutional arrangement. Notice there's no local government involved because they derive all of their power from state government. So it's really the national and state government working together to solve problems in order to try and address this. This is the basis for federalism, the basis for what we see in our federal form of government today, that sharing of power between national and state governments. Now, we see this in a variety of ways, looking at dual federalism, the idea of each layer has its own roles and responsibilities to carry out that power being distributed carefully among the national, state, and local branches, the layers of government, just much like the layer cake federalism we see here. That's the dual federalism, kind of in their own spheres, doing their own work. Cooperative is where they're working together, especially on areas of crises. So we see this with floods, with fires in the West, with tornadoes or earthquakes in the Midwest, and the hurricanes in Hurricane Alley down in the Gulf Coast. All of this taking shape in terms of national and state governments working with local governments to help people. Especially in times of crisis. Marble cake federalism is this idea there's really a mixture of responsibilities here. There are different issues, different programs, different ways of carrying things out and getting things done. It's messy. And so we see a lot of government involvement from the federal and state and local levels, all working together, but in different capacities, in different roles, depending on what phase of the project they're in, that kind of thing. Then we see permissive federalism, this idea of kind of the state taking on its own power given to it by the national government, and the national government giving them the power to do this, but also pulling it back if necessary. So a good example of this, as we see here, the Purple Line, the Bethesda to Silver Spring metro or light rail station that is in the future, depending on when they get all these contracts deals worked out. But the federal government basically giving money, giving resources to help carry this, and the state government really kind of taking and running with it in cooperation with local government to make that happen. That's very much the permissive federalism we see today. And then we have new federalism, the idea of devolution, passing back the roles and responsibilities from the national government to the states. That's the devolution that we see time and again, that is kind of a pendulum swinging back and forth. We see centralist, we see devolution. We see centralist, we see decentralist or devolution that's taking place there. And this is a back and forth depending on which party is in power, depending on which agenda is in power, and the role that government plays in giving that power back to states. And that evolution of devolution in terms of what we see there. We see this mainly among the Democrat-Republican line, but again, it's too general to really draw that line. We saw after FDR the expansion of the central government in terms of programs to help people out of the Depression, and then in World War II. Coming out of that, we saw a lot with the military-industrial complex under Eisenhower. So we see some centralists there. We also saw the decentralist or devolution under President Reagan, and the role of this new federalism taking shape there. We would see under President Obama the role of the Affordable Care Act and centralizing a national health care program to provide for those that need it, allow people to have the health care through their employers, and really trying to bridge gaps so that everyone is taken care of, and health is wealth, right? So we see this back and forth in terms of that devolution. Now we are seeing that pendulum swinging back in terms of the Trump administration, rolling back regulations, rolling back different rules for different agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, in terms of rolling that back and pushing that back to states for them to handle those types of issues. So we do see a pendulum swinging back and forth on this devolution centralist type of approach. Moving to our next item, number 4, we see the systems of government. We see a unitary system that is more the central government has the power. We would see this in France, or Great Britain has done some devolution, but very strong unitary government. The confederal, more like what we saw in the Confederacy, more under the Articles of Confederation, where you have stronger states government and the central government is much weaker. And then we have our system, the federal system, in which there's a sharing of power, that handshake once again between the systems in terms of working together for the betterment of the American people. And that is the system that we have had under the Constitution from 1787 until now. The advantages of this, obviously, Justice Brandeis calling this a laboratory of democracy. What are some advantages of this sharing of power? Well, you can try things out. You can see what works and develop a best practice around things that do work, and basically kill the projects that don't work and find new ways to do them. And this is really the goal of keeping government closer to the people, encouraging people to vote and take action and participate in government and take a bigger role in terms of carrying all this out. But like we have advantages, we also see some disadvantages. It is hard for the government to respond quickly when there's a national issue. They do respond, and they do respond with full force of the federal government and state governments behind it. It's also hard to hold people accountable when there's so much pluralism going on in terms of different levels of government and different branches of government with all different levels of roles and responsibilities on these particular issues. So it's really hard to hold people accountable in terms of what to do there and how to carry out. It also means that different policies are interpreted in different ways in different states, and in terms of how that is carried out in that state power sharing with the national government makes it rather difficult for the those in the central government to figure out ways to provide for those that need the help. And we've seen this with violations of rights for women, for African Americans. And the list goes on in terms of the roles that federalism plays and how hard it is to bridge those gaps sometimes. We saw with 1876 and the end of Reconstruction, we started to see segregation laws and black codes, Jim Crow laws taking shape in the South. And the government stepped in to try and provide ways under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment to stem this. But there were loopholes. And then the government tried to step in order to bridge those gaps and close those loopholes. And we saw that with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Fair housing in 1968. But again, loopholes. And we see the courts taking a role in some of this, ruling part of the Voting Rights Act unconstitutional a few years back. And all of this is a part of that advantage and disadvantage in terms of the sharing of power between national and state governments. We have many governments across our country, thousands of them, as you can see. But the idea is how to get them to work together for the betterment of the American people. That's the tough part in terms of doing anything consistently, doing anything in sync with the other governments. It's a much greater challenge, and that is hard to get your policies around in order to streamline that and to implement it or execute it. We see powers of the national and state governments. We see delegated powers. These are powers that the national government has under the red box there. And these are things like declaring war and making treaties or printing money. We see the state government has reserve powers, things like conducting elections, which are held at the state level. Voter eligibility is determined by states. Issuing licenses like marriage license under the full faith and credit clause. These are reserve powers. Anything not enumerated to the national government is reserved for the states. That's the 10th Amendment. Then we see shared powers or concurrent powers in terms of the national and state government that share these powers. These are things like collecting taxes and establishing courts, as well as spending money to help citizens that are in their states and in their respective jurisdictions. All of these are powers that are shared by the national and state government, really bringing to life the idea of federalism. We see denied powers as well. The national government can't violate the Bill of Rights. It also can't change a state's boundaries. State governments can't print money. They also can't suspend a person's rights to due process. We see that under the Bill of Rights. And the national governments, along with state governments, can't grant titles of nobility or deny the rights that have been given to citizens under the constitutional amendments that we see here. All of these are denied powers to government. We then move to the idea of implied powers. This is through the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause in Article 1, Section 8. What can be logically drawn as a power that the government has to carry out the roles and responsibilities that their respective article in the Constitution has given them the power to do. And then inherent powers, what powers grow out of the assumption that the existing powers that you have allow you to be able to do this. So we look at implied powers as not specifically in the Constitution, but implied through the Constitution. Things like creating a national bank. And if you have the power to collect taxes and you have the power to print money, then it is implied that you have the power to create a national bank to store this money, to serve as a distribution center for this money and collection center for this money. Inherent powers say that with the powers that are given to the government, such as the president as chief executive, that the president could conduct foreign affairs. The idea here that Congress has a power to investigate as part of its legislative function. It makes the laws, but it also needs to know what laws are working. So it needs to hold hearings. It needs to investigate. It needs to ask questions. These are inherent powers of the national government that we see here, inherent powers that are playing out, growing out of the existence of the government that is there and the roles and responsibilities that it has under Article 1 and Article 2 of the legislative and executive branches. Then we look at this idea of funded versus unfunded mandates. Funded, we're giving you money to carry out this mandate or requirement that you have to do. Unfunded mandates, much more common until recent years, and basically saying, well, here's the mandate, but we don't have a lot of money to give you. And we see kind of a combination of these. Now, we've seen fewer unfunded mandates. The Unfunded Mandates Reform Act of 1995 definitely reduced the number of laws and regulations around it, but we also know that over time new laws are created, new funds are given, and then slowly taken away, and sometimes not so slowly. Some of the Medicare provisions of the Affordable Care Act, for instance, were funded mandates, and now are more unfunded than funded for states to have to carry those burdens and try and find ways to pay for those items, which is much of why states may not be as friendly to the Affordable Care Act as other states. And this really stems from this idea of the burden that states have to carry with it, with these unfunded mandates. So there is a back and forth. There definitely is a back and forth here of the idea of funded versus unfunded mandates. And we've seen a mandate that is funded initially, eventually tends to lose popularity and also lose funding along the way. And so it ends up being much less funded and much less appreciated as time and money goes away. The powers of the national government, it's important to note, come from these four places. And in the notes, if you look at the notes that are on My MCPS Classroom, the link to these Google Slides, you can click on each one of these and go to an explainer that talks more about the Supremacy Clause, this idea of when national and state governments conflict. Article 6 of the Supremacy Clause says the national government wins. In the case of war powers, the president is commander-in-chief, but the Congress has the power to declare war. And so how do we reconcile these in terms of the power that comes from this? The War Powers Act said that the president can send troops in for 60 days, but then Congress pulls back and says, we want to give that authorization. We don't want another Gulf of Tonkin resolution that led us into Vietnam for years and years. So there is this tug of war going on between executive and executive and legislative branches in terms of war powers and the power that each holds in terms of its constitutional responsibilities to protect the American people. We also see the most common area where where laws are made today is the Commerce Clause, regulating commerce, not prohibiting it, but regulating it. And we see this time again in terms of regulating trade between the states or trade between our country and other countries, and the role that this plays in terms of regulating commerce, the role. Now, within the state has that power to regulate commerce, but once it crosses state lines, then it is a function of the national government, and they have taken significant authority here. Some pushback from the courts, mind you, but significant authority here. And then the last one, the Taxing and Spending Clause, the ability to tax, the ability to spend, again, all of this giving the national government more power in terms of the roles that it plays here. We see interstate relationships under Article 4, the idea of federalism, the sharing of power among states in addition to just the national government. We have 50 states. So the Full Faith and Credit Clause says that marriage licenses, if you move to another state, it's still valid in that state. Same thing with a driver's license. I don't need a new driver's license to go to Virginia. I can drive in that state with a Maryland license because they have the full faith and credit that the state that issued that license also made sure that I was licensed to drive in the state of Maryland and thus could also drive in the state of Virginia. Interstate privileges and immunities says if I go to a restaurant in Virginia and eat there, I'm not being taxed more or less than the residents that live there. Likewise, if I'm buying something, I'm not taxed more or less because the privileges and immunities that their own citizens have are also extended to me, and that includes driving on their streets, paying the same toll that they do on a toll road, that kind of thing. And then we have extradition, the idea that someone commits a crime, flees to another state, and they're caught. Will they be extradited back or sent back to the state in which they committed the crime? Absolutely. Extradition laws apply here, and Interstate Relationships says that they will be carried back. They will be sent back to the state in which the crime was committed to be tried. Their right to a fair trial, and that extradition law applies. We also see countries in which we have extradition treaties also will abide by that in sending people back to the United States and to the states in which they allegedly committed the crimes to stand trial. And the last one is interstate compacts. This is the idea of regional cooperation, the importance of a Chesapeake Bay Commission or some aspect of states working together in order to accomplish a goal. A great example of this is from the coronavirus, COVID-19. We saw a lot of states really working together from a supply chain point of view to try and secure masks and other PPE in order to help their medical professionals get the protection and support they needed in order to try and care for their patients on a daily, weekly, and perpetuity basis. But this is a good example of regional cooperation, an interstate compact of states that are working together for the purpose of trying to help their states in general lower costs and try and provide that material to their medical professionals. One example of this idea of supremacy we come back to is the role that the courts have played in changing and defining American federalism. And there's none other better example than the case of McCulloch v. Maryland. The idea that the state of Maryland wanted to tax a national bank. Did they have the right to do so? And did the federal government have the power to establish a national bank at all? Well, the Supreme Court stepped in on this, and in doing so, really helped define, mold, and shape what federalism is, that sharing of power. And it said, well, okay, Maryland, we understand your perspective, but you can't tax a national bank because the Supremacy Clause in Article 6 of the Constitution says, when national and state government laws conflict, the national government law is supreme. And this is the idea that we see here in the case. Does the national government have the power to establish a national bank? Well, we learned the idea of those implied powers that they do. If they have the power to coin money, they have the power to tax, they have the power to create a national bank with which to store those resources. But does the state have the power to tax the federal government in this capacity? No, not under the Supremacy Clause. And this helped to define that sharing of power between national and state governments. Now, let's talk grants. Categorical, very formulaic. Punch in some numbers, punch in a number of people that are going to be helped by this, punch in how many of them are below the poverty line, how many of them are minorities, how many of them are receiving different government welfare programs and other types of things already, and you can basically get a number of how much money you're going to get as a result of these categories that you have placed them in. That's very categorical, very formulaic, and that's what we see here with a categorical grant. Lots of strings attached in terms of making sure that you're filling out the paperwork correctly, making sure the information is accurate, that kind of thing. We don't see that as much with a project grant. Project grant basically says, here's some money, it's for this specific purpose. You're doing a particular project and use it for that space, but how you use it within that project is up to you. Here, take the money and go. Versus, and again, there's some strings there, but not nearly as many as categorical. And then we get to block grants, which is just basically big free pot of money. Here it is, go, run with it. And sometimes they'll say, hey, this is to be used for education, or this is for healthcare, or this is for whatever. And it's very few strings attached to it. So we see a lot of block grants. States love block grants. And the reason is obviously because they don't have as much to cater to the national government in terms of trying to carry that out. Now we see this happens in different ways in terms of states giving more than they get or getting more than they give. But the idea here is for every dollar going to the federal government, how much comes back? How much actually returns to the state? Those with a bigger federal or national government presence, such as a lot of the federal lands in New Mexico, for instance, would see a greater return on the federal spending dollars. Maryland, for instance, being so close to the Washington, D.C. area, is benefiting from that, and every dollar we send to D.C. actually comes back $1.30, because a lot of the agencies and departments within the executive branch are actually located here in Maryland. In addition, Virginia, $1.51 of every dollar going from Virginia to D.C. comes back to the state of Virginia because of the placement of many of those departments within the executive branch that are located in Virginia. The Pentagon, for one, the Department of Defense, as one example. So a lot of money coming back to the states in those types of grants in those spaces. Keep in mind that this is a generalization, kind of an overview, but Republicans tend to favor block grants, grants with less strings attached to them. Democrats like to use this more to try and change behavior and get what they want. So they will dangle a carrot of this block grant in front of a state in order to get them to change their policies, or at least align their policies with what they want, what they want the state to do. And then states obviously have much more feelings about block grants than categorical, because there are much fewer strings attached to it, and the benefit there is much greater for states to be able to not have to jump through a bunch of hoops around categorical grants rather than just getting a block of money, which is what they prefer. So we continue to see this evolution of devolution, this back and forth. So the idea here is Republicans like to give money to through block grants to states. We see the Democrats will give the money, but again, they like to change behavior, so probably more categorical in nature. And where we saw some more centralization with those like Lincoln and FDR, think Civil War, think Great Depression into World War II, we saw some decentralists. Jefferson very much so, looking at the perspective as letting Virginia kind of do what Virginia does. And President Reagan, in the Reagan era, in the 80s, really where devolution took a lot of shape in terms of passing down the national governmental powers to states and giving that power back to the states. The idea there is that is first order devolution. The states sometimes will pass that down to local governments sometimes to charitable organizations. Sometimes it kind of falls through the cracks, and then it gets elevated again to the national government, and the pendulum swings back in the other direction. So we continue to see this back and forth. And as I mentioned, President Obama, more of a centralist in terms of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, trying to centralize and come up with a way that provides a healthcare framework for individual states that are carrying it out, but a national framework in terms of trying to help people who need it in those differing states. And again, we see with the Trump administration that pendulum swinging back in the other direction, the idea there of rolling back environmental regulations, and the EPA, for instance, kicking that back to states where it applies, and again that evolution of devolution continues. We see this through key events. The idea of the Civil War, as I mentioned, Lincoln very centralizing of government to try and bring the Union back together. We saw in the Industrial Revolution more a decentralization or devolution. This led to big business. This led to kind of Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, looking at the really bad working conditions that many employees had in those working environments, which led to the emergence of unions and the role of labor unions and trying to kind of centralize the workforce in a more of a national scope and scale. We see the Great Depression again bringing us back to try and provide government programs, the ABC soup of the New Deal, really trying to help people where they are, those that need it. And many of them did need it. And then we see that changing with the role of World War II, leading us into World War II and out of the Depression. And then we would, at post-World War II, we would start to see that delving back into decentralization again. We saw segregation and black codes, Jim Crow laws, leading to the civil rights movement. With the Brown v. Board decision desegregating schools in 1954 and ultimately the civil rights movement of the 1960s. So again, the pendulum swings back and forth, but the idea here is it is federalism at work. Federalism may be more centralized, it may decentralize, but the idea is that it is a sharing of power that continues, and the pendulum and the evolution of this federalism, this sharing of power continues back and forth to this day. Regardless of who is in office, regardless of which party controls Congress, which party is in the White House, we continue to see this ebb and flow of a sharing of power between the national and state governments. Federalism is alive and well. All right, I hope you found this helpful on these top 12 highlights from Chapter 3. We will see you once again in the next chapter on the legislative branch, but good luck on the upcoming assessment.